I am exchangeable for NATO. That's what Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy told UK journalists on March 2, 2025. 5 words, no hesitation. It sounded like just another political statement, but it wasn't. Because in those 5 words, Zelenskyy made one thing clear. His own fate means nothing compared to Ukraine's future. But how did we even get here, to this unthinkable dilemma? And will Ukraine truly have to choose between its fearless leader and the safety of NATO? This video has all the answers. Let's start with the most obvious question: why? Why would a leader of Zelenskyy's stature openly state something so drastic? Well, truth be told, those 5 words are probably the most measured thing said in a while. You see, the weeks leading up to this statement were filled with outright insults thrown at him, as well as an absurd meeting that made these 5 words seem almost tame in comparison. No drama, just facts. But who has been hurling all these insults at Zelenskyy? Well, none other than the US President Donald Trump and his posse. In a social media post, Trump called Zelenskyy every name under the sun, from branding him a modestly successful comedian to accusing him of manipulating the former US President Joe Biden like a fiddle. He painted Zelenskyy as an opportunist, only interested in keeping the gravy train rolling, a leader whose popularity had plummeted, and someone who had done a terrible job managing the war. Trump even went as far as to label Zelenskyy a dictator without elections. And that last part was what truly got to the Ukrainian president. After all, we're talking about a man who spent 3 years fighting against a real dictator, Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And yet here was Trump, apparently Putin's new mouthpiece, labeling him the very thing that over 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died fighting against. The irony is almost too much to bear. Of course, every single one of Trump's statements has since been debunked. Zelenskyy didn't suspend the 2024 elections to cling to power. He did so because Ukraine's constitution prohibits elections under martial law, which was implemented after Russia's invasion in 2022. This wasn't a power grab, but a legally mandated move during a state of war. Zelenskyy's popularity also hasn't plummeted, far from it. His approval rating, though variable due to the war, remains strong at around 63%, contrary to the 4% figure Trump has thrown around. This approval rating also directly contradicts Trump's claim that Zelenskyy has done a terrible job at managing the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's quite the contrary. He has led Ukraine through one of the most difficult conflicts in recent history. Despite overwhelming odds, Zelenskyy managed to rally both his people and the international community, allowing Ukraine to still stand 3 years after being ruthlessly attacked by what was perceived as the second strongest military in the world. But it doesn't matter whether Trump's words were baseless or exaggerated, because the damage they've done to the US-Ukraine relationship is very much real. And remember, the US has been the single largest donor to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. According to the German think tank the Kiel Institute, the US has allocated $68.4 billion in military aid, $53.44 billion in financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine between February 24, 2022 and December 31, 2024. So as you can imagine, losing the US as an ally wouldn't just be a hit to Ukraine, it would be a catastrophic blow to its entire defense effort, possibly changing the course of the war. But you see, it's precisely this aid that has caused the rift between Ukraine and the US in the first place. Let us explain. Once Trump was re-elected as the President of the United States, all eyes were on him. The main question was whether he would continue supporting Ukraine or put an end to the billions in aid going to the country. Well, Trump, widely known as a transactional president, initially chose a secret third option, a slice of Ukraine's future. At one point, he suggested that Ukraine offer 50% of its valuable mineral resources to the US as a thank you for all the aid previously provided, or perhaps as a condition for continuing that aid. We're talking about resources estimated to be worth over $26 trillion in total. Zelenskyy rejected the initial draft of that deal, as its terms were heavily skewed to US interests, offering little to Ukraine in return. Zelenskyy was firm in his stance. This wasn't a fair deal, and it wasn't how allies should behave. However, it seemed that Zelenskyy eventually caved as he traveled to the US in late February to sign that deal, among other things. But he never got to do this. Why? Because all hell broke loose before he got a chance to sign on the dotted line. Zelenskyy walked into that Oval Office meeting on February 28, 2025 with high hopes, a peace deal, a mineral agreement, and perhaps a chance to strengthen Ukraine's critical partnership with the US. But what he got instead was a confrontation that no one could have predicted. The meeting started off innocently enough, but it morphed into a spectacle after some 35 minutes. Zelenskyy, who had been more than willing to negotiate, was met with nothing but criticism from President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Trump's promises of peace had turned into ultimatums. "You're gambling with the lives of millions of people," he warned Zelenskyy, who seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. It was clear that Trump, with his bold claims and fiery rhetoric, wasn't just seeking a solution. He wanted control. He wanted Zelenskyy to bow to his terms, which were far from fair. "You're gambling with World War III," Trump shouted, raising the tension and the stakes. But Zelenskyy, not one to back down easily, stood his ground. He refused to be intimidated in the face of Trump's blustering accusations. Even as Trump raised his voice and accused him of gambling with the world's fate, Zelenskyy remained calm, his arms crossed, his gaze steady. He also didn't flinch when Vance accused him of airing disagreements in front of the media. He countered each attack, making it clear that his duty was to his people, not to Trump's demands. His calm defiance was a testament to the strength he had shown since day one of the war, the strength that helped him make one thing clear. Even in the heated Oval Office, his country's survival was worth every battle, even against the most powerful man in the world. And how did the most powerful man in the world react to being challenged in his own house in front of the world? Well, you know Trump, ever so cool, calm and collected, no ego whatsoever. He probably handled the entire thing gracefully. Yeah, right. Of course, the American president exploded in full Trumpian fashion, turning the meeting into a verbal battleground. Vance joined in on the tirade, which isn't surprising given he's been a long-time critic of the US aid to Ukraine. "Have you even said thank you once during this entire meeting?" he barked at Zelenskyy. The Ukrainian president, who had thanked the US numerous times in speeches, on social media and in personal meetings, still held his ground. "I've said thank you many times." But none of that seemed to matter to Trump and his allies. They expected more, a kind of undying gratitude that was impossible to measure in mere words. And so the meeting ended prematurely. The scheduled lunch was cancelled and both men parted ways in anger. Trump even reportedly expelled Zelenskyy and his entourage from the White House, widening the rift between Ukraine and the US. Unsurprisingly, many were outraged at how Zelenskyy was treated in the Oval Office. The US officials, however, decided to frame this treatment very differently. Instead of expressing disbelief at Trump's behavior, they actually suggested that it was Zelenskyy who needed to be removed from office. Talk about adding insult to injury. Lindsey Graham, ever the vocal critic, didn't mince words. When asked if Zelenskyy should step down, the US senator said, "He either needs to resign or send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change." Quite the diplomatic touch, eh? Then there's Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, who joined the circus, suggesting that Zelensky's leadership was a hindrance to peace. He stated, "Something has to change. Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that." That's some good old "you're either with us or against us" attitude for you. Both of these high-profile figures seemed more interested in wielding political power than actually supporting Ukraine in its hour of need. But unsurprisingly, Zelenskyy refused to bow to these calls for resignation. He made it clear that he would only resign on his own terms. And these terms, of course, include a NATO membership for Ukraine. This brings us to the statement that started the entire video. After the chaotic scene in the Oval Office, Zelenskyy didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, he hopped on a plane and headed straight to the UK. He went there to meet other European leaders and King Charles III, no less. No big deal. He met the king at Sandringham on March 2nd, arriving there in a military helicopter. The UK people, some holding Ukrainian flags, gathered to catch a glimpse of the Ukrainian president and express support. It was a moment to show the world that despite everything, Zelenskyy wasn't alone. Inside Sandringham, he met with King Charles, shaking hands by the entrance before heading inside for a conversation that lasted just under an hour. Though we don't have the details of it, one can imagine it was far more pleasant than Zelenskyy's previous White House encounter. What we do have details of, however, is the press meeting he held in London on that same day. A day or so after his turbulent White House visit, he reclaimed the stage. He had a message to deliver, and no one was going to stop him. But believe it or not, the message in question wasn't about the events that transpired in the US. In fact, he almost avoided answering questions about the Oval Office incident at this round table. However, he didn't shy away from addressing his previous comments on Ukraine's NATO membership and doubling down. But what were those previous comments? Well, Zelenskyy has long advocated for NATO membership for his country. This isn't anything new. However, he intensified these calls after the initial breakdown of the mineral deal. He was resolute. Ukraine needed security guarantees, reliable and clear ones. Guarantees that would make sure that the war would never come back to Ukraine's doorstep. A peace deal that would guarantee Russia never again destroyed lives. It was obvious Zelenskyy was talking about NATO membership here. And he said so himself on February 23rd, a few days after Trump labeled him a dictator without elections. This is when Zelenskyy did what few leaders would. He offered his resignation. In a jaw-dropping statement at the Ukraine Year 2025 conference in Kyiv, Zelenskyy said, "If it is for peace in Ukraine, then I am ready to leave my position." But that's not all. He also offered to step down in exchange for NATO membership, the first time he proposed this unorthodox swap. This statement was the embodiment of Zelenskyy's singular focus, security for Ukraine. It wasn't about him staying in power, it was about Ukraine's survival. A president who puts his country's future above his own position. That's leadership, the kind of leadership that makes history. Fast forward to March 2nd, when he was asked about his comments on resigning in London. Once again, Zelenskyy didn't flinch. He said the 5 words that opened this video: "I am exchangeable for NATO." He was essentially saying, "No problem, take me out of the picture, but make it count." He added that NATO membership for Ukraine would mean that he had fulfilled his mission. In his mind, NATO membership was the ultimate prize, and he would accept nothing less as his legacy. But the question remains, would the Ukrainian people accept his resignation? Zelenskyy touched on this in his remarks. He said, "To change me, it will not be easy, because it's not enough to simply hold elections. You would need to prevent me from participating, and it will be a bit more difficult. In other words, good luck." Then, as if he wasn't already a master of deflecting tactics, Zelenskyy responded to the US officials, including Elon Musk, who called for his resignation. He pointed out the obvious. The citizens of other countries are telling Ukrainians which president they should have. Let's be clear, Zelenskyy wasn't just defending his position. He was criticizing foreign interference, which he rightfully labeled as undemocratic and unconstructive. It's almost miraculous to witness these words coming from Zelenskyy after the absolute humiliation he endured just a day earlier. One minute he's being publicly eviscerated by Trump and Vance in front of the world's media, and the next, he's standing tall and deflecting attacks with the calm of a seasoned diplomat, not a modestly successful comedian, that's for sure. This is a man who had just been subjected to one of the harshest public beratings imaginable, and yet he wasn't rattled. In fact, he was anything but. Sky News journalist Yalda Hakim, who had the privilege of sitting beside Zelenskyy during the roundtable discussion at Stansted Airport, was just as astounded by his composure. She described how Zelenskyy's spirit seemed as steadfast as ever. Despite the obvious difficulties of the past weeks, months, and let's face it, years, there was no sign of regret or defeat. She described him as defiant and resolute, a leader who was, in no uncertain terms, not going to bow down. And that was despite everything Ukraine had endured. "We're fighting for freedom and democracy," Zelenskyy said, standing firm in his conviction. Hakim was struck by how this defiance was the same quality that had made him a global symbol of resistance and leadership. Even when the most powerful country in the world seemed to be turning against him, Zelenskyy had the strength to stand tall and fight on. But will his fierce fight pay off? For now, it's paying some dividends. The European leaders are certainly rallying behind Zelenskyy like never before. After the crushing critique the Ukrainian president faced in the White House, they wasted no time in showing their support. French President Emmanuel Macron, Poland's Donald Tusk, UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, and Canada's Justin Trudeau all took to social media to express solidarity with Ukraine. Interestingly, Zelenskyy replied to each individual post with "Thank you for your support," which many perceived as a jab at Vance. But some possible pettiness aside, the European response wasn't just limited to social media. These leaders weren't just posting, they were also mobilizing. Starmer was among the first to make it clear that the UK was prepared to back Ukraine's peace with boots on the ground and planes in the air. This was also reiterated at the London summit where Zelenskyy was also present. As Starmer revealed, multiple countries have pledged troops to a peacekeeping mission for Ukraine, contingent on a peace deal. The summit also brought a game-changing announcement. The UK revealed a deal to send $2 billion of export finance to Ukraine for 5,000 more air defense missiles. It's the kind of commitment that speaks louder than any diplomatic speech. As Starmer explained, Europe must do the heavy lifting now, implying that NATO can no longer rely on the US. Given that Trump would halt all military aid to Ukraine just 2 days later, on March 4th, we'd say he was right on the money. And this realization goes beyond the European commitment to Ukraine. Countries like France and the UK are also ramping up their own defense spending. The UK, for example, will increase its defense budget to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. That's no small feat for a country that barely surpassed NATO's 2% threshold in 2015. NATO's General Secretary Mark Rutte also spoke out on ramping up defense spending in line with the summit's objectives, though he didn't go into details. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, echoed his sentiment, saying, "We urgently have to rearm Europe." She also shared her unexpected vision for turning Ukraine into an indigestible steel porcupine for any would-be invader. This vivid imagery reassured Zelenskyy that Europe was still very much standing shoulder to shoulder with him. And the continent's leaders aren't just offering words of comfort, they're offering missiles, troops, and an unyielding commitment to peace. But wait a second, what about NATO? After all, that's what Zelenskyy has been after for years. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha put it bluntly in late 2024, "We will not accept any alternatives, surrogates, or substitutes for Ukraine's full membership in NATO." Once again, it's important to emphasize that Kyiv views NATO as the only real security guarantee against Russian aggression. But is NATO membership likely for Ukraine? Truthfully, that path seems more complicated than ever. As of now, this membership sadly isn't on the cards for Ukraine anytime soon. The current discussions only center on a coalition of the willing, an alternative framework spearheaded by Starmer. This, however, is far from a full NATO membership. It's a plan to secure peace, sure, but it's not close to the ironclad protection NATO offers. Remember, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty clearly states that an attack against one NATO member is an attack against all of them. This is the only provision that can truly stop Russian forces from invading Ukraine again. However, US officials have turned out to be a significant obstacle to Ukraine's NATO membership. President Trump, for example, has been adamant recently NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine. US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz agreed, saying that NATO's Article 5 protections aren't meant to cover Ukraine, warning against the idea of US troops being obligated to defend Ukraine under NATO. Instead, the US is pushing European nations to take on the responsibility for Ukraine's security. So it seems the doors to NATO are locked for Ukraine right now, but the country's fight for security is still far from over. And this begs the question, who's holding the keys to these doors? Well, it's the same country that insists Ukraine must remain neutral while simultaneously razing its cities, kidnapping its children, and rewriting history to pretend it never existed in the first place. That's right, it's Russia. Russia and its ever-so-compelling concern about NATO expansion. This is the same country that's trying to justify invading Ukraine because the distant possibility of this country joining NATO in some far-off future is such a grave threat to its security. It's not like NATO doesn't have Russia practically surrounded now. But let's not get bogged down in the facts, shall we? Russia's line here is basically Ukraine can join the European Union if it wants, but NATO, absolutely not. Now, Putin can frame Ukraine's NATO membership as a security threat all he wants, but in reality, he didn't lift a finger when Finland and Sweden joined, despite his incessant red line talks. The truth is, Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO since he's hell-bent on erasing its sovereignty. Judging by his words and actions, he won't stop until Ukraine's culture, language, and identity are wiped off the map. NATO is just his excuse to roll his tanks over a country he can't stomach being independent. Then there's the whole issue of demilitarizing Ukraine. Or, turning it into a sitting duck. Putin wants Ukraine disarmed because a disarmed Ukraine is a Ukraine he can walk all over without facing any real resistance, and NATO certainly doesn't fit this picture. And with the US unexpectedly pivoting toward Russia under Trump, Putin might just get what he wants, all of it. And Ukraine, it's left fighting for its future in a world that keeps moving the goalposts. But let's not kid ourselves. Even if Zelenskyy walked away tomorrow, Russia wouldn't suddenly accept Ukraine entering NATO. As mentioned, this was never about one leader or one decision. It's about erasing Ukraine as a nation. But what do you think is going to happen next? Do you see Zelenskyy somehow leading Ukraine to NATO membership and then stepping down? Or do you also agree this membership isn't on the cards for Ukraine, no matter what the country's president does? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.